Welcome to the BPM 360 podcast. I'm Russell.
And I'm Caspar. And together we will help you navigate the treacherous waters of the BPM adoption journey. I hope you enjoy the podcast.
Russell, good morning, my friend. How are you today?
Good morning, Caspar. I'm great. The
You're
sun's
great?
shining. It's a beautiful morning. I'm super happy.
Oh,
And
very
and
good.
and it's Friday.
It's Friday. Yeah, we're back to recording on Friday.
Well,
It feels relaxed, isn't it?
it's different than Monday mornings,
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah, of course. Everything is different on Monday morning. And there's not a reason to be cheerful because we're recording episode number 10.
Wow.
Our first
10.
mini anniversary, I would say.
Yes. And we're running up front. Obviously, we've already published quite some, and responses have been fantastic. So
Absolutely.
it's astonishing how many people are reaching out and saying, yeah, like it, and I like the communication, the conversation, and get me involved. And I said,
Yeah.
okay, so have you done? Are you into BPM? He said, wow, just starting, just starting. I said, okay, come on board,
Oh, yeah.
But then people are just happy that to see. And I think, as we would say, we're not the only podcast out there, but maybe just it's a part of the network, or maybe because I'm also in the German region, and there's a different maybe view on this. I don't know what it is, but there is a real direct response there that people are saying, you're talking about it, good,
Yeah.
keep it up, and get us involved, so coming back to that point, definitely. We got a couple of episodes in front of us to get the framework covered, but we were discussing this. Definitely, we want to get into the interview mode,
Yes.
the
We
book
will.
readers club mode,
Oh, yes.
and whatever. So here it's I think it's good. It's motivating to also move forward and accomplish the framework. Have this as a baseline to always cycle back to. We also said that we need to also at some time cross not just each block of the framework in itself, but look at, say, the interactions between different framework components. There's still a lot to cover.
Yeah.
And we've got 10. Let's
We'll
keep
get
moving.
10. And it was an interesting week because I was visiting London for, among other things, a BPM conference for one day. In a workshop around process performance excellence given by none other than Roger Tregear, which is kind of a celebrity in the BPM world. So I got another book to read. So the book club list is stacking up. I just need to find a time to read them. But we're definitely going to go ahead, finish up the framework. And having said that, let's just dive in and let me paint a little bit of a picture of what we're going to be talking about today. Russell, and then I'm very curious on your take on that. So the last quadrant of our framework is what I labeled human affairs. And human affairs sounds really vague and all encompassing, and maybe because it is, but it deals with the human element in BPM. And some people might think like, duh, that's obvious. In my experience from projects I've been doing and customers I've been talking to, it is anything but obvious. The fact that you're dealing ultimately with people is something that's been overlooked quite some, I would say. And you can think about a couple of different aspects that are also part of the framework where I say, listen, you need to think about how do you organize your whole BPM project, but also your BPM business as usual after the project is done. You need to think about how are we communicating this? Because communication is nothing else than making sure that other people, other humans, know what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it. And in so many cases, I ran into the situation where they started the project really enthusiastically. We're going to do this, and everybody's behind it, and we're going to do a process inventory, like Michael Schein calls it, or a process repository, as other people call it. And then they hide themselves in a project room for about 6 months, and then they come out and say, "We're done. We have a process landscape documented." and the whole rest of the organization has moved on and totally forgot about them. That's something that obviously you don't want. So I would argue that, let's say, underrating and underestimating the human element in a BPM project is one of the root causes for failure. Bit of a bold statement, but how do you look at that, Russell?
I would agree, and I don't think it's such a bold statement. I think nowadays people do understand how important it is to carry out initiatives and not just build up some ivory tower in a lab and then come out. And I think in other episodes we've talked about how important it is to think about the use case and how process management actually acts as a service to other initiatives and gets involved here. And also, I think if you look at the other parts of the framework, so in sponsorship, we talked about stakeholders a lot, and who's involved in governance, and in the CUE part, again, we were talking about ownership, end-to-end ownership, and so we have definitely touched these topics. And I think typically, if you look at BPM frameworks and approaches, there is always this part where you are talking about roles and responsibilities and people, but I think it's very good that you have this as a separate part, like standing out, where you say, okay, but now we have to think with the focus on human affairs. So not as people just have to talk to somebody to get get the budget, but let's turn this around and have like the people in focus and say, because ultimately a lot of the initiatives you're doing is about establishing a process-centric thinking, but also in the case of, let's say, process excellence, the thinking of excellence. What does that mean? And how do I achieve it? And process is a means to get there, to understand in detail what you're doing, to then be able to do it repetitive on a high level of quality or speed. And for compliance, again, it's about, not just purely about building in, let's say, error-free systems that can make sure you work compliant. Because if people don't want to, they will just won't use the system, or they'll go around it. So again, here, in all the use cases we have, it's about getting people to really, not just, as we said, as a means to collaborate together, but also for them to have a better understanding of their purpose in the organization. And this is one. So what we're talking about is the wide span of that. Ultimately, in an ideal process management world, it touches everybody. And process management has an impact on everybody. It has and you're taking everybody along on this journey of common understanding. And now that sounds maybe bold or even a bit like pathetic.
No,
but it's so what I'm saying. So you talk a lot of time, sometimes about process management as it's you want to operationalize the strategy, but ultimately, isn't process management also something to isn't that the best way to actually also transport your company culture?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
So, because what is company culture all about? It's about people understanding and talking to each other as well, and having certain values, but also you have policies like you don't want child labor, or you don't want to be fraud,
obviously,
fraudulent, really hard, like compliance things that you want to embed in your culture, but also sustainability. But isn't actually also here process management helping you to reflect on how do even policies and company cultural elements that are vital for the way you work together, how these are interweaved in your day-to-day doing?
So basically hardwiring, it's the hardwire part for your culture.
Yes, I think definitely it's so if there is anything about your strategy, then it's also a lot about the company culture that you want to establish. And also here and as I say, it's not so much about let's have the activities sequenced out and we follow these and we automate these, but it's more on a this higher level of the framework where you also link up certain, value drivers, business drivers, and policies into the process and says, okay, this is this process. How does it have an impact, or how can our company culture help make this process better? Yeah, so
Yeah.
it works both ways here,
But
and this affects everybody. That's why human affairs is something where I think you have to have a dedicated reflection on
yeah,
how are we touching people and how are we taking people along.
but and I just had an interesting client conversation this week, where I was talking about process management in general, and at a certain point in time, the question was asked, so who's the audience for this? And I always give the same answer. I said there's two audiences for this, two groups of people. On the one hand, you have the experts that use any type of tool to document, to create and maintain it. It's a relatively small group typically within your organization. Process experts, process modelers, process owners, maybe a small subset. On the other hand, I say there is a consumption perspective, and then the entire company is your audience, your target audience. Everybody. Doesn't matter who, because if you describe your processes to a certain level of detail where it's needed, which, by the way, I'll come back to that in a second, was an interesting insight from yesterday's workshop, then all the people that are relevant on that level automatically become the audience for your BPM project. Because ultimately, what good does process documentation do if there's nobody to consume it? You're not making. Let's get that one out of the way immediately. You're not making a process model because you want to have a process model. It's not the end goal.
Yes, and you use the word documentation. I always get a bit of a cringe when I hear the word documentation. It's so it sounds so
Yeah.
terrible.
I know,
And
but yeah.
so it's like there's this fine distinct difference where I think, and modeling is already a different word. Yeah, already makes a difference. So when
That's
I say
true.
something is documented, so you come in somewhere like let's document your inventory. Yeah, so you go in and then you do some counting and write it down on a piece of paper. The process inventory. Yeah, so you
Yeah.
count your processes and say, I've got 5 processes. These are there they are. Bam. Instead, you've documented your processes. Okay. Now, the term modeling, I like a bit better but then again, people just say, I'm making a picture of this, so I'm documenting it in a different form. That's modeling. I said,
Oh.
no, not quite. Because only if these people that engage in process management actually really think about the process, dissect it, and then based on that result, they then put it into a model. Yeah, then they
Yeah.
create this model to then do further analysis, simulation, communication on it. Then it becomes a value. But
Yeah.
I would say this intellectual part of, you said, the experts. Yeah. So they're capturing their insights and their knowledge on the process in a way that it can be used.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not the document that is then shelved. It is, we are creating a baseline to do something, to
Yeah.
act. So I analyze and I create a baseline for doing things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So optimizing them to communicate, to spread the word on how we want to work, and linking it up to make to create understanding of the results of a process, what affects it, what
Yeah.
impact it can have if you don't do this, so like the risks that are there and the controls, the risks are there to say, if you don't do that properly, if you don't have a 4I principle, this can go wrong. Did you realize that? I said, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's an insight. So, and this is something in the whole communication. It really bugs me. Sorry,
No,
I was a bit of a got lost there, but
oh, don't worry.
when I'm talking to people, that's something where I say, no, you have to understand the value, and I think it's also for the sake of the process experts. They kudos out to these guys that have such deep knowledge and share it
Yeah. Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they sit down and create a model and say, let
Yeah.
me explain all this complex stuff I have in my brain by putting it down into a form
But
that can be shared. Yeah.
let me get us lost a little bit more then, because
Yeah.
I very agreeably disagree with this for part of it, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
When I started getting involved in this, which is a long time ago by now, just like you, by the way, a lot of people thought that BPM stood for business process modeling, not knowing that the M stands for management, not modeling.
Mhm.
I mean, and a model is, I always learned, a simplified depicting of reality. But the word is simplified.
Mhm.
You can do that any way that you want. Um, Documentation is a more encompassing activity that can include a model, but probably also includes other parts of information about that process. And ultimately, what you're doing in a document, or not in a document, but what you do when you document something, you describe reality. It goes a detail level further than just a model. Now, I know that you can attach all kinds of information to a process model nowadays, but the reason why I started using the word documentation instead of a model is because I got a lot of negative connotation on the modeling side, because people start to
Okay.
think, what the heck can I do with a model? I mean, what? And so for me, documentation means the model plus all of the linked resources and linked context. And so we mean the same thing. We just use the words exactly opposite.
Yes, and it's interesting how it is taken. Say, as I said, I studied chemistry, and for me, of course, the model is the baseline of all scientific kind of like evolution. And so you
Yeah,
have a very
yeah,
simple atom model, and it explains certain phenomena. And then you realize that there's a limit to this model,
yeah,
and that you have to expand your model. And I think with process management, it's also interesting to see, depending on the use case and your also your insights that you have. You could have a very simple model to say like an input output, and that's all
hmm,
sufficient. But sometimes you want to go a level deeper because you need to understand more the interactions and the functions that you're having
yeah,
with your, let's say, ERP system. And then a different type of model can help you. And
yeah,
ultimately, the documentation. I was thinking about this. Yeah, we're going to get in there and say, yes, but what about a to-be process? It's not just the reality. It's sometimes also the vision of where you want to be. So the
it
model
typically
of it,
is.
and
Yeah,
but you can also document a future state.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. Oh,
and
absolutely.
so documentation modeling. But I think we both agree. And coming back to the point, you were talking about the people that produce and the
Hmm.
people that consume. And as long as the people that are producing understand that they are that their target group, who they are producing for.
Oh,
And then
yes.
the documentation and modeling gets to a level where we say, okay, so let's think about what we're doing, not just for the sake of ourselves. Because if I go out and tell my mother about the atom model based on SP and whatever kind of like orbits, and put down a mathematical matrix to explain it to her, she's gonna go, what the hell are you talking about? But if I say,
Yeah,
yeah, just think of it like,
yeah, yeah.
nuclear something, electrons flying around,
Little
and
balls with sticks in
stuff.
between. That's
He said,
it. Yeah,
oh, that's fantastic. It's like the moon and the earth. I said, yes, similar, smaller.
yeah. Smaller.
And
Yeah,
but then so it serves the purpose to then explain something. So here again, and this makes process management quite interesting, because what I always love about this talk is, and this is something where the process architecture again comes in. It's not just for the sake of purely managing like the structures and decomposing complexity. It's also a means of communication. So when you're talking to your managers, they have their own questions and they need their own insights. So you need discussions. We talked about ownership. So you need to structure it in a way and say, let's model
yeah,
our or document our organization in the sense of we have certain like domains. And is it 100% correct? No, because they're all interweaved, from
yeah,
ordering, you come to, logistics, and they need to purchase whatever. So there is a big network, but let's simplify this and make this easier understandable, and we can allocate people to take care of this, and it all
yeah,
makes sense. And then we go a level deeper to say, let's look at, the next level. And and this has a different audience, and the model
True.
serves a different purpose. And so we need
Yeah.
to think about this and dissect it and set it in a different manner to manage these people and provide them with the information that is relevant for them
Yeah.
without being too abstract on a domain or being too detailed on an activity level. And so a lot of the discussion around process architecture and all these nitty-bitty this is right or this is wrong. I said, it depends. It depends on who it is for.
Yeah.
And you have to learn as a producer of let's say this model
Yeah.
documentation, who does it serve?
And that's an interesting point. And let me just explain this with an example that happened to me last night. So I was driving back from Düsseldorf Airport to home.
Okay.
And I was driving on the highway, the A46 between Neuss and Heinsberg. And all of a sudden, there's a sign that says Vollsperrung. In other words, they just blocked the entire highway. So that part of the communication is okay, because I know that I can't just keep driving because I'll probably crash into some maintenance vehicle that they're doing something on the road. So they actually force you off the highway, and then all communication stops. And I'm like, all right, I just want to go back to the highway a little bit further on after the roadworks. Where do I go? I'm not familiar in this surrounding, but there was zero communication from the German roadworks. So they make a change in the process, so to speak, because they blocked the major highway. That's your normal as-is path. And you need to take a detour, and then they don't tell you what the detour is. And
well, the thing is, though, and there is no better word than the German Umleitung.
Yeah, Umleitung. Yeah, but even that word wasn't there. Normally, I know there's an Umleitung sign, and so a detour sign, so I followed that. And the problem is that it must have been a very last minute thing, because even Google Maps didn't know that it was completely blocked. So it just tried to keep me sending me back to the same exit that I just exited out of the highway. It trying to put me back on. So I dig deep into my knowledge and think, well, I need to go approximately there. And that's what people do in a process as well. At the moment that the main road is blocked in a process, they need to know which alternative routes do I have. And if there is no route, they become creative. And that's what you see happening in SAP, for instance, very often. You describe a process, you document it, you model it, you link it to the transaction in SAP, you go in the process mining, and you come to the conclusion that people are doing something completely different with exactly the same result.
Mm.
And then you start to think about how should have we communicated this to the end users. It's a bit of a long example, but it all comes back to communication, I think. How do you make sure that you open up and you disseminate that body of knowledge that you have in your repository, just to bring it back to the aggregated level? How do you disseminate that to the end users so that they actually like to consume that information without thinking that they need to struggle their way through a process hierarchy, which, let's be honest, most people don't care about. I know that's an even bolder statement in the BPM podcast, but still, it's my belief.
My mind is still stuck in your Vollsperrung. I'm so shocked that in Germany you would not have an Umleitungsschild. That is unheard of.
I was shocked too.
That is totally unheard of. And I can only imagine that something like some big petrol tanker exploded. Yeah. And somebody said, okay, but I have to put up a Vollsperrung sign, so that people don't drive into the flames.
Yeah, but
he forgot to do the Umleitung, and then there's Caspar Jans talking in a podcast about how could it be that in Germany there's a Vollsperrung without an Umleitung sign, and this poor firefighter still there blowing out the flames of the tank. And says,
in all honesty, there was no firefighter, because a week earlier when I drove the same route, it was already going from 2 lanes to 1, and they sent you over the emergency lane, and I thought that was still the case.
Okay.
And even so, Google Maps thought so, by the way, and they normally quite up to date. But anyway,
coming to your other bold statement. So, you were saying that people don't understand. I think one thing about somebody has to understand the architecture, and somebody has to understand when to use something and human affairs is about making sure that the people get the right information and don't get lost on non-existing detours.
Yes, please.
So I think learning to work with the let's say the inventory, the repository, that this is a point of reference to come back to. And a lot of the challenge is actually to because the company is so full of a lot of information, it's ever changing. And I think the big challenge is to really create such a big community of people that they will ultimately say, okay, I agree to disagree, I'm not quite sure. Let's get back and go to the point of reference. And this will then be revolving around the process documentation. And I'm sure people have to understand that it's like this process and the process inventory, the repository is there are a lot of connected elements, artifacts that not originally are like the policies or working procedures or compliance topics that are maybe managed in different areas. But only if you bring in this context to the business, to your operations via the process repository, that you can then actually facilitate such a dialogue. And the big challenge is, if you want to touch each and every person in your company, you have to take them on a journey there to again and again say, let's go back, cycle back and see where and how we have actually written this down, documented this. And coming back to your process mining example and saying, and if this does not fit to your reality, we have to do something about this.
Oh, absolutely.
And this is automatically results then in a change. Either a change of your documentation, and there's your documented perception of how you work. So it's an insight, it's an altered insight. Or you said, yeah, well, that's not so clever the way you're doing it. We did, for a good reason, define it in this way. Let's talk about what we can do to make this straight. So you don't maybe what is the reason? Maybe you have quality issues, and then you're realizing and saying, but the way you're working, that can't work out.
That's
true. Or you're not applying the policy, and we're getting issues, and but there's a communication misunderstanding. From this threshold, you have to get a sign off from, yes, but we already documented from this department, and maybe the documentation isn't quite clear, and the people are getting confused. Then you have to adapt the documentation to help people. But even by doing exactly this, working with the people on what is your perception of reality, how do you operate, how do we understand from a, let's say, in a process management perspective with the experts and owners, that we believe that you are working or should work, that you're already creating this continuous improvement and communication and better understanding, which ultimately, I also humble it, I think is then soothing for the company culture. So it's not all, definitely not, but it's an element on not leaving people in the dark, not just telling people just do it and don't ask me why, but getting into more people, elevating them, enabling them to do things based on sound understanding, and then being able to have an understanding of where they can deviate and still complying with the key, I would say, the key objectives of a process. So here it's not all about just writing down dedicated SOPs, but also for creating an understanding of, why do we do it like this? If you were to deviate because the machine breaks down, what are the vital outputs that you need to produce, and who are you producing them for? And how could you, let's say, be not agile, be more flexible, or how could you improvise and still achieve a compliant, good result? And no robot will be able to do that. If you say go left, they'll go right, and then there is a Vollsperrung. So that's when you're kind of like going, so, okay, what do I do? Do I just take the car, break through the barrier, go over the fields, and get back home, straight line? Or do I say I comply with the rules of the street? and then I take a certain logic, but I will still follow the objectives of being compliant with all rules and regulations. And
Yeah.
on the other hand, still find my way there to be on time for dinner at home. And this you
Yeah.
only do because you have you've been trained in the procedures and the rules and the compliance of how to drive a car, and you can improvise. Yeah.
So now I have to be very honest. If I'm driving there at 11 o'clock at night, I just want to get home. The urge to get through that barrier is bigger than following the Umleitung that wasn't even there. But I comply to the rules
Yes.
in this particular case because I also didn't know where to go otherwise. But anyway, so if I look at that from a summarizing point of view, because we're already talking about this for close to half an hour, it is about providing context to people so they can consume the information in a way that's relevant for them. And that's one of the biggest use cases that why you need to have that good communication between any type of BPM profession that you have in your organization and the rest of the organization.
Mm.
And of course there are different ways of going about that. And I think one of the easiest ways to do this that's typically not done is to make sure that you set up a drumbeat for communication. That you say, listen, certainly during the implementation phase of BPM, you should do it more often, but later on, at least once a quarter, make sure that you communicate. It could be a newsletter or a little video, or you make it more frequent, but you need to celebrate the little wins that you get. So the little positive use cases, and occasionally you also need to attend Fuck Up Friday and share your losses and where things went wrong, so people can learn from that as well. But that communication drumbeat is one of the things that I see a lot of companies not do, while it will help the adoption rate of your BPM initiative so much. Having said that, I think we need to wrap this one up already, Russell, but let's continue the conversation around human affairs in the next episode, because I think we still need to talk about the organization part of it. We talked mostly about the communication part, I think, today. How does that sound to you?
Yes, I think because you were talking about this dedicated communication part, there may be some aspects we need to also dive into because
of course.
I think we were talking about the general kind of aspects of human affairs, which I think is super important to say. Ultimately, we've gone through this framework. This is the last part of the framework, but ultimately that is the end goal. To touch people, to get people involved. So when you're looking at it from what you want to achieve, this is actually where it ends, or from your thinking should start. What do I want to achieve? How do I want to get to the people? And without communication, that's not going to happen. And that's why I think this is it makes a lot of sense to cover this at the end. But ultimately, this is really the whole purpose of process management is to get and touch the people and get in touch with them and communicate with them, add them some value. And yes, and the next time going into the organization. Yes, that's definitely an own topic as again.
And interesting thing that you mentioned. I mean, yes, this is one of the end goals, is to touch people. Remember, the very first thing that we talked about in the framework is how do you explain the need for BPM to one or two persons? So it starts with one or two, your executive sponsor. How do you explain it? How do you convince a person that you need to do process-based management? And it ends with communicating it to all people. And everything you do in between serves the purpose of getting it from convincing one person to explaining it to everybody else why you've succeeded implementing it and why they should need it.
Yes, you have this effect that you start off small and then you start making it bigger, building up the community. And I think that's something around communication and organization we should dig into, to say, oh, okay, and really be maybe some hands-on to say, okay, what do we think can work? Not just we're saying very generalistic, and maybe we can get down from experience to say, okay, what time frame are we talking about, and what specific elements do we see in communication that can work, and how best to combine them. That's something we should definitely also try to cover with the organization, but it's also the how do we get there? Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's nothing like we've defined the organization, it's there,
Yeah.
but it as you said, it starts with the sponsorship over then the key roles of the
Yeah.
COE, and
Yeah.
then coming into process experts owner style, and then beyond that, and you cannot do that alone. So
No.
if you do not start managing to build up an organization and rolling this out, it's not going to happen, and that is something.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where you need to
Yeah.
be at. You
Let's
need
not
to
spoil
have
too
a
much
plan.
for the next episode, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, cool.
It's been a pleasure again. Russell, number 10 is in the books. Thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend because
Likewise.
it's Friday, and we'll talk again soon for the next episode.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye, man.
Bye.